If you've ever been to court and wondered what people go through when they don't speak English and they need interpreting, I interview a courtroom interpreter who interprets Spanish to English or English to Spanish for defendants or witnesses when English isn't their first language. In most American courtrooms, when you give your testimony, a lawyer might ask you something, of course, in English. But when English isn't your first language, an interpreter is there as a vessel to elaborate communication back and forth to avoid any misunderstandings. In any courtroom, it's important to understand the questions that are being asked of you so you don't compromise yourself or others in perjury. There are many reasons why you might be called to court, either as a witness or as a defendant, and asked to testify, where in some cases it might not have anything to do with you. Maybe you were an eyewitness and serve as providing proof in a case for something that happened to someone else. Or you can be a witness for sorting out your own lawsuit for something that happened to you. Keep in mind that the opposition can also get you to testify. When you testify, it can be in a deposition or in court, both having the same result. Testifying means listening to questions and answering them honestly under oath when asked. It can be as simple as yes or no questions, answers to first-hand accounts of evidence or proof of some facts. You might ask yourself, what's a deposition? A deposition is when you're first asked to raise your right hand and say, I swear to tell the truth and nothing but the truth. This is a chance for any party litigation to get information from witnesses and parties. This is an essential task when being sued or suing someone. Now, when answering questions under oath, it's very important to answer honestly, because this can be used later in trial when needed, to either catch you on record of lying to further impeach you by using your own testimony provided in your deposition. Remember that you're under oath and lying can be subject to perjury, where you face serving jail time. In any case, it's very important for anyone to be well informed of what's being asked of them, even if English isn't your first language. In this episode, we hear the perspective of a linguist and the obstacles he faces with trials and tribulations in a court of law when interpreting. I asked the linguist how he got started in becoming an interpreter and what kind of education does it take to get into this particular job field. What are some of the courses to complete like?
So when I was little, I remember that I really liked languages in general. And when my family and I moved to the US, as I grew up, my parents would tell me that I should look into court interpreting since it had to do with languages. And I didn't really care for it that much at the beginning. But after I went to college and I studied linguistics and I left college, then I decided to pursue court interpreting by going to an interpreting school. And at the school, I found out that I had to go take a test to become a court interpreter. So I prepared myself at the school to go take it. I went to take the test, I passed it, and then that's when I was able to apply and be qualified to work as a court interpreter for the courts. The courts here in California, what I remember when I applied was that they need an associate's degree and they need the court certification, which I think that the university degree is kind of low for the type of career that you do. You need much more, I feel. For example, in Europe, I know that you have to have a bachelor's degree for sure. Some people go into masters and things like that. People here in California or in the US also do that. They go for their masters in, translating or interpreting, and that works. But you basically just need an associate's degree and the court interpreting certification to work here in California.
Generally, what is learned in linguistics school is the logic of prepositions. In other words, the science of language. Postpositions, like when some languages have an adjective before the noun or some after the noun. Things like phonology, phonotactics. In almost every language, the uses of different sounds that make up the accents or expressions. For example, in Spanish, the R. The R is constantly rolled. In some words, like words like flor, meaning flower, or repetir, which means repeat. Or in French, like the sound oo is constantly used. How a B or an A sound or the letter H, how exactly air is passing through your tongue to make turbulence with your lips to make sound appear in different phonemes.
The school that I went to which was a specific interpreting school, they make you take 4 classes. The first class that I took was Introduction to Criminal Proceedings. The second one was Introduction to Criminal Proceedings 2. The third one was Side Translation. And then the fourth one was Advanced Interpreting for Criminal Proceedings, from what I remember. Nowadays, I think the school has broken it up into 8 courses in total. But once you take all those courses and you pass them all, then you get a certificate from the school, but the certificate isn't any good. You need the actual certification from the state. You can retake the classes as much as you want, no matter how many times you want to take them. Each course for me was about $500, and I think there are other good programs, university programs, that can offer you training into becoming an interpreter. But the school that I went to was well known because it prepared you for the test. And ultimately, if you want to work as a court interpreter, you need to pass the test. So the school gave me all the vocabulary, the types of words that they look for at the test. And so that helped me out a lot.
Court interpreters are in high demand. According to a recent study, more than 200 languages are spoken in California. Of the state's 36 million people, about 20% speak English less than very well. That's almost 7 million Californians who would need help from an interpreter if they found themselves in court.
So I remember clearly that in the first course, the Introduction to Criminal Proceedings 1, we learned a lot of vocabulary. Like, we had to do flashcards of, how to say court in Spanish, how to say bail, how to say proceeding, things like that. And I remember that I would make flashcards, I would study them, and then in school they would make you practice. The teacher would play a recording and then you would just interpret using the vocabulary that you learned from the week. At first, they teach you how to just interpret in the same language, or not really interpret, but repeat in the same language. So the teacher will play a recording and you have to repeat it in that same language that you're hearing at the same time. That will prepare you to gain the speed and at the same time focus on what you're hearing and putting out what you're hearing at the same time. That was the first course. The second one was pretty much the same, just keep doing it, But obviously we moved from repeating in the same language to doing it into the other language. And we also learned the 2 different modes, which are interpreting simultaneously and consecutively. Simultaneous is the one where you interpret what you're hearing right away at the same time that the speaker is speaking. But for consecutive, you listen to the message first, then the person pauses. You have to memorize what they're saying by taking notes, and then you have to interpret that into the other language. It's a really hard thing to do. I think people may think that it's easy because they haven't tried it, but when you try something and you see how hard it is, that's when you realize that it's not easy. And so the school is teaching you for this skill. It's not teaching you how to speak Spanish or how to speak another language in case you interpret it for another language, but they teach you the skill. Interpreting is a skill. It's like, just because you have 2 hands doesn't mean that you can automatically play the piano. The same thing goes for languages. Just because you are bilingual doesn't necessarily mean that you are an interpreter.
There usually are 5 branches of linguistics: phonology, morphology, syntax, semantics, and pragmatics. Phonology, the logic behind language, how patterns and forming of systems work. Phonetics, the sound in which language is used to make the language, the nature of speech sounds. Morphology, how words are formed and correspond with one another. Syntax, the set of rules that concerns the structure and formation of sentences. Pragmatic is looking at the context of what a speaker is referring to in a cognitive way and in a not literal or denotive way. Semantics is the focus on means of expressions, how we draw meanings from words. Pragmatics focuses on the context and implied of meanings. I asked the interpreter what his first language was and what's most compelling about further understanding the use of linguistics.
So, being that Spanish is my first language, when I came to the US, I was about 11 years old and learning English was not easy. I remember that I would grab a dictionary and I would just start reading the first pages, and the first pages teach you the key on how to pronounce words. And for some reason, since I always liked languages, I always found that interesting, and I would just look up words randomly and I would look at the pronunciation key and I would try to pronounce it exactly how it's meant to be pronounced. And that really helped me with my pronunciation, I would say. And just practice, practice, practice. Regarding the experience or the education that you need, if anyone wants to go into this field of interpreting, I think that they could either study linguistics, which is what I did, or they can pretty much study anything, because I've learned in my experience that no matter what you study, you will become good at that field when it comes to interpreting. So even if you just want to study criminal justice, that will be really helpful for when you want to become a court interpreter, or if you want to study medicine because you want to become a medical interpreter, I think that will be very valuable. You don't just have to study linguistics in order to go into this field. You can pretty much study anything.
What you should keep in mind is why you're getting into linguistics. A very important thing to consider is what type of job field you want to base your linguistics study on. For example, you can become a linguist professor, or a liaising translator, forensic linguist, technical writer, or in this case, a court translator. It's important to have an understanding on what type of study you want to focus on and for what reason before getting your linguistics degree.
So when you get your certification from the state, there will be a time period where they will send you an enrollment packet. Once you receive it, you fill it out, you mail it back to the state, and then they put you on this roster of interpreters, which anyone can find online. And then you pretty much then have to go look for a job. Either if you really want to work as a full-time interpreter at a court, then you have to go and apply at one of the counties and then hope for an interview, which a lot of counties here in California are short-staffed with interpreters and they will need interpreters, so it's very easy to get an interview. In my case, I remember that I lived in LA County and I applied there, but I never got an interview from them right away. So instead, what I did is I looked at other surrounding counties and I applied at many of them, and one of them called me right away, and then that's when I went in for an interview. So yes, once you get your certification, you have to apply for the courts. Or if you want to work as a freelance interpreter, you can also just contact the courts and tell them that you are a freelancer and that you can work for them in certain days and things like that. And if they're willing to hire you for the day, then they'll do that. And you also have the option of going to agencies, interpreting agencies or language agencies, and they will hire you to be a freelancer for them. They'll call you and they'll tell you, we need an interpreter in this city on Thursday at 9 a.m. for a deposition. And if you can do it, then you can say yes. You give them your rates and then you go do the job. After you finish, you submit an invoice to them and then they'll pay you. Hopefully they'll pay you right away, because I've heard stories of interpreters that don't get paid right away or that they don't get paid at all. It depends on what you want to do. If you want to be a full-time interpreter at a courthouse, or if you just want to be a freelancer. So when I was studying in school, I remember that my school had like a job fair where an agency came in and they were hiring interpreters. So I was able to work as a freelance interpreter for some time. And also I remember applying at this phone agency. So I was a phone interpreter for some time, which that is a hard job to do actually, because you have no visual context of what's happening. You only hear voices on the other end of the phone. So it's hard to interpret that. But I did that for about 4 months, I would say. That's while I was still waiting for LA County to, grant me an interview, which they never did. So once I applied to the other counties and one of those counties called me, that's when I went to work for them.
So depending on your level of experience in 2023, court interpreters make an average of $20 and $35 an hour, with a typical potential of 40 hours a work week. That comes to $1,400 a week, 4 weeks out of a month, that's $5,600, making your annual income before taxes to $67,200. The numbers do change per city or state according to ZipRecruiter.com. In this section, I asked the linguist what his typical day consists of.
So typically my day consists of being assigned to a courtroom where multiple cases get heard a day. That's what the interpreter's office does. At my county, they assign interpreters daily to the courtrooms that have multiple cases. I show up to that courtroom, I sit and basically just wait until the cases that need interpreter get called by the judge. Sometimes while we're waiting, we help out attorneys if attorneys need to speak to their client privately. So they'll come up to you, they'll tell you, I need your services. You go and help them out. You do the conference between the attorney and the client. And if you need to fill out paperwork, you'll do that too. Then once you finish that case, you might help out another attorney. The work does not have to be linear in a way, if that kind of makes sense. You basically just have to help out where you're needed. And then once it has to become official by the judge, then that's when you go on the record. That's what they say, going on the record. And you formalize everything, and then the case gets done for the day. I would say that my value in contributing to this podcast is to make people aware languages are not easy. Languages are not math. In math, 1 + 1 will equal 2, but in languages, 1 word can equal 3 words, or 7 words can equal 2 words. So it's not an easy thing to do to interpret, and there are many nuances behind interpreting that people don't realize. A lot of people think that just anyone from the street who is bilingual can do this type of job, but you need to have training, obviously, as we said at the beginning. You need to develop the skills needed to do this job, but also be culturally aware of the differences between the two cultures that may impact the outcome of the conversation that you're having or the interpreting that you're doing. So the difference between interpreting and translating is that in interpreting, you deal with spoken language, and in translating, you deal with written language. And the best analogy that I can give to the listeners is that when you play a sport such as volleyball, for example, in which you have a ball, think of the ball as a language. Just because you can play volleyball doesn't mean that you can play tennis, which also uses a ball. So the skills are similar in which you're playing a sport and you're using a ball, but they're also different because if you're a tennis player, you're not necessarily a volleyball player. So same thing with interpreters and translators. Some of them do both professions. They do interpreting and translating, but a lot of them also just stick to one, either interpreting or translating. So in the case of this defendant, where our office assigned 2 interpreters to do team interpreting, one interpreter is there helping out the other interpreter in case the other interpreter, needs water or needs a break, but they switch back and forth after some time, and they interpret the entire trial to the defendant. And the trial can last a couple of days, it can last a week, it can last multiple weeks, it can last months. It all depends on the type of crime that's committed. And a lot of times the jury selection will take a long time because you don't know whether a juror will be a good candidate to listen to a case until you start questioning that juror through voir dire, which is the legal term for questioning jurors to see if they're a good fit for a case. That can take a long time, selecting a jury. I've noticed in my experience that when it comes to trials with child molestation or child abuse, that takes a long time to choose a jury because a lot of people have gone through that in their lives. And it may not make it to court, it may not make it to the news, but a lot of people do have gone through that, or they know someone that has gone through that, and so they're not a good fit for that jury. So many times in those cases, the court will have to pull more than one panel of jurors to see whether they can sit in this trial. They'll have to question 4 or 5 panels to select those 12 people that will be needed for the trial and the alternates.
Just in case if you don't know what voir dire means, it is the process used by the parties to select a fair and impartial jury. During voir dire, the jury panel is questioned by both lawyers on either side. The questions are intended to help the lawyers in the jury selection process. Why voir dire is so crucial or valid is because you don't want to have biased jury making decisions based on preconceptions. In evaluating the jury with voir dire, some individuals can be excluded participating on trial to avoid biased decision-making.
The court will know that those jurors have gone through that once they get voir dire. And so during voir dire, they can do it openly to the whole jurors there in the courtroom. And usually the judge will tell them that if they have something to speak about in private with just the court and the attorneys and the court staff and no other jurors, then a lot of people do opt to do that. In cases with like child molestation or child abuse, I've seen that they just automatically start questioning them privately. They'll have everyone wait outside and then they'll just bring one juror at a time and then they'll ask them, if they've gone through anything like that or if they know someone, either themselves, a relative, a friend, and then they'll start opening up. And you'll see that a lot of people have those emotions buried in them. And once they start being questioned, it just opens the door for them to just, it brings back memories and they just start crying. And so you can just tell right away that they would not be a good juror for the case. So that's how the court finds out, by interviewing them individually rather than in a group. When you interpret for witnesses, that's when your skills do get put to a test, because everything that you're saying into English is becoming part of the record and everyone is paying attention to what is being said in English. So even if you speak really great Spanish or whatever foreign language you speak, if other people don't know that language and they just see your mouth moving, they might think that you're doing a great job, but they don't know because they don't speak that language, right? So to me, it's always when you go into English, that's the challenge, that's the test, that's when all eyes are on you. And that's when, if you make a mistake, if your pronunciation is not good, if you don't use the right prepositions, if you don't use the right expressions, that's when people can think, oh, that's not a good interpreter, And it's hard, especially when you're not a native English speaker. For example, in my case, sometimes it's really hard to think of the correct idiomatic expressions in English or the correct preposition that needs to be used. And I see some of my coworkers who are native English speakers, and when I hear them interpret, I'm just like, wow, I wish I could sound like that, And I just can't. I think that I have improved in the last few years that I've been there. My interpreting into English has improved, especially because lately what I do now is I just practice going into English. Because most of the time we're just going into Spanish. We just go, we hear English and we're just like putting out our words in Spanish. But I noticed that that's the test. The test is when you go into English. So I try to practice with podcasts. I listen to them, or I'll watch a YouTube video and I'll listen to what they're saying and I'll try to interpret it simultaneously into English, And I think that's improved a lot. Even a coworker of mine told me the other day I was doing a good job. And then I told her, I think that I have improved because of that, because I've been practicing more going into English than into Spanish. So one of the stories that I can remember from many years ago is this case where I interpreted in a preliminary hearing for a witness. And a preliminary hearing is where the district attorney has to present a case to the court, the judge, and he has to show that there is sufficient evidence for the defendant to be going to trial. So, it's kind of like a mini trial where they call witnesses and then they testify. And at the end, the judge will decide whether, yes, there's enough evidence to hold the defendant to answer in a trial.
So a district attorney is the person who prosecutes criminals who break the law, prevents crime from happening, supports and protects victims of crime. When someone is arrested, they carefully review the facts and evidence. They carefully look to file criminal charges that go beyond reasonable doubt. They look to the justice system to carry out the case. A judge, a public defender, a defense attorney all play key roles making the case, while the judge and jury decide the fine or punishment on what the case is proven.
So I remember that I was interpreting for this witness a man who had been robbed by this woman, and I don't remember exactly how it went, but I just remember that he somehow ended up in his own passenger seat and the defendant, the woman, got in the driver's seat and she asked him to give her his money. So he pulled out his wallet and then he I understood that he put it in the glove compartment because the preposition he used in Spanish was en, en, and that in Spanish can mean in, So he said that. So I said that in English. I said the wallet was in the glove compartment. So I remember that the hearing kept going on, and then when it was time for the other attorney to question this witness, the attorney said to him, "Do you remember that you said that you had the wallet in the glove compartment?" And the witness said in Spanish, "No, I never said that it was in the glove compartment." And I just remember thinking to myself, where did I make the mistake? I remember clearly that he said it was in the glove compartment. Like, this couldn't be. I did not hear wrong. I heard correctly. But then it turned out that when he used that preposition in Spanish, it has multiple meanings. It can mean on or in. So he meant to use it as on, that it was on the glove compartment. So on top of the glove compartment, not inside the glove compartment. And I just remember I got kind of scared. I remember just my heart rushing, thinking, oh God, I made a mistake. Like, this is gonna, be bad. But in the end, this usually happens. I feel like when you make a mistake, sometimes it just gets fixed. And I guess that's one of the good things about people not really knowing how hard languages can be, because they just don't give much care to it. I guess that's a good thing. Like, even though I complain about people not knowing how hard it is, when it comes to situations like that, that's when I realize, like, okay, it's a good thing that a lot of people are ignorant about this. The repercussion can happen when you actually interpret something that was not what was said. For example, if they said yes, but you say no, I feel that that can obviously have a repercussion in the defendant's outcome of the case. But at the same time, I feel like that's something that anyone can notice and they can call you out for it. They can say, that's not what the defendant said, or that's not what the witness said. Some people have, because of their lack of education, they will focus on certain things of their case that have nothing to do with the case or the outcome of the case. For example, I remember that, and this didn't happen to me, it happened to a coworker. She was telling me about it, but there was a defendant that was being charged with transporting drugs. So basically what he did was that he had drugs in the car and he was transporting them somewhere, but the drugs weren't his. And the attorney was trying to tell him, that these are the facts of the case. This is the offer that they're making you. I think that you should accept this offer because it's good in your case if you take it to trial. Since you don't have a really strong case, you could lose and it could be worse for you. Somehow the defendant's wife was there and she was chiming in and she was just saying, those drugs weren't his. Like, he shouldn't be charged with this crime because those drugs weren't his. And my coworker said that they were trying to tell the wife, along with the attorney, that, it doesn't matter whether the drugs were his or not. The crime here is that you're being charged with transporting them. So I think a lot of people focus on little things like that where they don't see the bigger picture. They don't see what's really at stake. And they think that because of something insignificant that to them is important, they think that they can save their case like that. And that's not the case, So that's one way where people do end up hurting their case more. So I remember this one case where the defendant was being charged with, I think it was soliciting a prostitute, or I think that it was, I don't remember the charge exactly, but it was something like he had the intention of, having sex with the prostitute. And so I was doing the conference between this defendant and his attorney, and the attorney was telling him, these are the facts again, this is the offer, and you can either accept it or refuse it. We can go to trial, but I don't think that you have a strong case.
So it's always interesting how plea deals work. It can be very tricky depending on the severity of your case. The majority being that everyone that faces legal criminal charges, plea deals are offered to you, the defendant. It's up to you to decide whether you're not guilty or there's overmounting evidence that says you're guilty of the crime you're being charged with, and if you can weather out the storm while you're in jail. Do you decide to fight your case by pleading not guilty, taking it to trial and waiting in limbo while being incarcerated to see what happens? In other words, throwing the dice. Maybe your defense finds evidence that goes in your favor to drop the charges. It's costly and time-consuming, but you could get your case thrown out and be found not guilty and not have charges reflect on your record. This is a recording I found on the ACLU's channel on YouTube.
We think that criminals go to trial and they face a jury of their peers, and there's some deep deliberations and soul searching, and a judgment is rendered.
That's not the reality of how the system works. Of those cases that end up resulting in a guilty verdict, about 95% of them come up with what calls a plea bargain. No trial, no judge, no jury.
Take our plea, and you might get 2 years, 3 years, 5 years in prison, or risk it and go to trial, in which you could get found not guilty and walk free, or you could face what's called a trial penalty, 10 years, 20 years in prison.
To understand the power that prosecutors wield, you got to try to put yourself in the shoes of that person. So you combine the force of being locked up and being homesick and wanting to go home, the fear of what you're missing on the outside, the risk of going to trial, and it's this perfect equation, this perfect combination of forces that make even people who are innocent plead guilty.
So judges and prosecutors rely on plea bargains to keep the system moving. If everyone who had a defense took their case to trial, the system would collapse.
Plea deals are quick, they're easy, they happen in a flash, but the consequences are a lifetime.
The defendant just kept insisting that, he didn't do anything. He didn't do anything wrong. He didn't have sex with the prostitute. But he wasn't understanding the fact that that wasn't the crime that he's being charged with. He's being charged with having the intention of soliciting sex from this woman, And again, I feel this is one of those situations where people just focus on other things that in the end have no outcome in the case, but they think they will help their case by saying, well, that wasn't mine, or that wasn't what I was going to do. But, they're still being charged with the crime, and they need to focus on what the crime is. I don't remember if the prostitute was maybe undercover or if the police just showed up at that place. And, there are certain places in a city where that's happening. So I guess the police shows up and they just catch everyone that's there, I don't remember if that was the case. In many instances, I feel that the people's lack of education is what hinders them from, understanding what the case is and what the outcome of the case can be for them. And it's a big cultural thing because, to be realistic, I feel that a lot of people who come from our countries, Latin America, to the US is because, they're looking for a better life. And in their own countries, they don't have the opportunities of, having a good education or having good jobs and stuff. So when they come to this country, they have really low education. They only have, second or third grade education. So you're basically dealing with a child that has that type of education. When you're in second grade, you're 8 years old, I think, and third grade, you're 9 years old. So you basically have to, in my opinion, I feel like when you deal with people that have really low education, you have to explain to them as if you were explaining it to a child. Not because you think that they're dumb, no, but it's because that's how much understanding they have like a child, So if you start using big words, or if you just talk to them assuming that they know what you're talking about, they're not going to understand. And because in our cultures, you say yes to everything, you just nod your head. Even if they ask you, like, do you understand? They'll just say yes, because out of respect, they feel like they have to say yes, even though they probably don't understand what is being said to them, So I think some people can end up hurting their case as well, is that they just don't understand what's going on, and then they just sign papers, or, I think that's part of it. I think it happens often where they think they understand, or sometimes I don't even know if it's just me thinking that they don't understand, but they do. But in my experience, it's a lot of people just don't understand. And again, it goes back to that lack of education, I feel. Like I said, a lot of the people that come to this country that don't speak English is obviously because in their own countries, they don't have those opportunities. They don't have education, they don't have good paying jobs. So they come here, and the lack of education prevents them from understanding what they're going through, and it's hard because I feel that attorneys and judges, they just think that people who need an interpreter are probably just dumb, and that's not the case. Like I said, it's just the lack of education, but it doesn't mean that just because someone doesn't have a good education doesn't mean that they're dumb, But it does happen often where they don't understand. For example, I can think of some cases where they accept the offer that the government is making them to resolve their case. And part of the offer is, you'll be on probation for 3 years. You have to pay a fine of $700. Let's just say that amount. And then as part of the term is you have to pay that fine within 2 days of being released from jail, and then you have to, if it's, for example, like a DUI case, driving under the influence of alcohol or drug, you have to go to a school for DUI for 3 months, and you have to enroll in that school within 21 days, and many other conditions that people have to do. But when it comes down to it, I emphasize to these people, these are the things you have to do, but you also have to do them within this time frame. Pay the fine within 2 days of being released, enroll within 21 days. And I think that if I don't emphasize that, then people will just go on about with their lives, and, they will eventually pay the fine, they will eventually enroll in the school, but sometimes they will do it beyond the time limit that they're given. And so because of that, they end up violating their own probation terms, and then they end up going back to court. And those are things that I feel attorneys sometimes don't understand, that these people need to know what the time frame is to do those things. I remember one time in a case where this defendant came back to court because, they hadn't paid the fine. And then when it was time for the attorney to tell the judge why the reason was, the attorney just says, "Oh, I believe there was miscommunication, Your Honor, between the interpreter and the defendant." And, who knows what had happened before, but I don't like it when they just blame the interpreters, because if an attorney just doesn't explain to their client exactly what they need to do, that's not the interpreter's fault, that's the attorney's fault. And if the person doesn't know what it is they have to do, if they have to go pay a fine within 2 days, if they have to enroll within 21 days and so forth, then, they'll end up going back to court. And so, yeah, I think it's mainly just them not taking action when they're supposed to, because even if the fine is too high, like $700, the court will give you the option to make a payment plan, So as long as you just go to, within the 2 days, just go and pay, I don't know, $50, you've already complied, and then continue paying the fine until you pay it in full. But if you don't show up within that time frame, then you are violating your terms of probation. You were supposed to do it within the 2 days, From what I can remember right now is they get cited and released, or sometimes it just really depends on, for example, during probation, you're not supposed to commit any other crime. So if they go and commit another crime and then they go to jail for it, then they will remain in jail until, they either post bail but meanwhile, another case will be opened up in which they're violating their probation, so now you have the new case, and you also have a probation violation case. It goes back to, again, it has to do more with like the type of area that you grow up in, or the type of area that you live. If people are not educated, if they didn't really make it through high school and everything, then they'll end up, committing crimes, or just out of necessity, because if they live in a poor area and things like that. I think that's what it's mainly about. Like, it's not really about like what racial ethnicity you are. I think that's what it is, but I think that's just my opinion. It really has to do with like where you live and how you grew up and everything. I don't think having money will get you a better lawyer. I think that, yes, there are private attorneys who are great at what they do, but then there are also private attorneys who you will pay and will not do a good job. They simply just won't care. All they want is the money, Sometimes I see that defendants do better off with the public defender, the government attorney, than a private attorney. And sometimes if it's a really good private attorney, then yes, it's better to pay for that attorney and get out of whatever trouble you're in. I've seen a couple of private attorneys actually where they prepare themselves so well for a preliminary hearing where the case will just get dismissed right there and then instead of it having to go to trial, But if you hire a private attorney who's not really good at his job, who doesn't prepare, then you'll end up going to trial and you might end up losing. I would say for people to look out for maybe the way that you're treated by the attorney. If you make an appointment with the attorney and you talk to the attorney, if they're courteous to you, if they care about you, if they ask you questions, if they allow you to ask the attorney questions, I think that's a good indicator of whether the attorney will care enough about you to really defend you in court. If all the attorney says to you is, just pay me the money, we'll do the best that we can, don't worry about it, I got you, I don't think that's a good attorney. And by preparing themselves, what I mean is that attorneys will look at the police report, they will look at the evidence, they will prepare questions to ask in court of the witnesses to try to plant that doubt in the judge's mind so that they can dismiss the case if it's in a preliminary hearing. If you're in court and you see that the attorney isn't really asking that many questions to the witnesses, then what's the attorney there for,
How much a lawyer charges is a loaded question. Every lawyer is different, and every different case is different, so fees vary. Most criminal defense attorneys charge a flat rate. It's important to keep in mind how the lawyer you hired might increase fees as the case goes on, and what those fees depend on. It's important to ask what's included. What if the case goes into various different situations? What fees or fines might the judge impose on you depending on the outcome of your case? Find out how many cases your lawyer has worked on with your particular situation. You don't want to hire someone with no experience. Spend a bunch of money to find out they're incompetent. Most lawyers that charge you by the hour charge between $50 to $300 an hour. The law firm Sullivan & Cromwell, representing FTX and Sam Bankman-Fried and the lost money, according to court filings seen by Bloomberg, the firm has 150 lawyers working on the case who are charging rates ranging from $810 to more than $2,000 an hour.
Most of the time, I just notice that the system will keep someone in limbo because either the defense attorney or the district attorney are just not ready for trial. There's more evidence that comes up in the case that they need to research, or someone gets sick, like one of the attorneys gets sick, and so they have to continue the case, or maybe the defendant gets sick with COVID, they have to continue the case, and the more the case gets continued, the more other cases go to trial, and the less courtrooms there are available for when this defendant comes back to court. So I don't think that it's one of those things where on purpose they will try to keep the defendant in limbo. It's just the circumstances of life, I feel. From an interpreter's perspective, I would say that the places where I've seen a defendant just be in limbo is when they can't get an interpreter of that specific language that the defendant speaks. For example, there's many defendants who are from Mexico, but they speak an indigenous language. So these defendants are bilingual, they speak Spanish, but they also speak the indigenous language, and they feel more comfortable in the indigenous language, or their Spanish is just very limited where they don't understand what a Spanish interpreter is saying to them. So a lot of times the case has to get continued to another date because they have to find an interpreter of that language. So let's say that they tell you, your case will be continued for next week because we need an interpreter for this language. Then the office will try to search for that interpreter. They will try to find someone who speaks that language and, have that interpreter available for the next hearing. You kind of have to just see whether the interpreter will be someone who will understand the defendant and vice versa. Because sometimes, even though they might get you someone who speaks that language, there might be regional differences that make it difficult for them to understand each other. So then the case will have to get continued again because they need to find another interpreter. So I feel those are the situations that as an interpreter I see where some people just stay in a limbo and they just have to wait and wait, but how long do they wait? Because, right, yeah, they're waiting in jail and you have the right for your case to be dismissed if you don't get prosecuted within a time frame, right? So I believe that it's, if I remember correctly, it's 45 days from your arraignment hearing. The arraignment is the very initial hearing of a criminal case. That's when the judge tells you what you're charged of, and the judge sets bail for you, and they will tell you when you have to come back to court and stuff. So there are 45 days from arraignment, but this can be prolonged if the defendant waives the right, like I said earlier, where if there's evidence that comes up, your attorney might tell you, I'm going to need a continuance, so I need you to waive time. So you will voluntarily waive time, because you want your attorney to get ready for trial. But if your situation is one in which you speak a language that no one else speaks and they can't find an interpreter for you, then how do you know that you have the right for your case to be dismissed? You don't, you're just in a limbo. Like you said, you're just waiting to see whether they can get you an interpreter that speaks your language. I've seen people end up in jail, and while they're in jail, then all these other cases that they never took care of come back to haunt them. So, but what will usually happen is that once they go to court, they will try to put all those cases together and offer the defendant like a global deal on how to solve all the cases together. Sometimes it'll be like, you have 3 cases. The case that we're going to deal with is this very recent one, and the other 2 are going to get dismissed. And if you do this, this, and that, and they'll just accept the offer. Or sometimes they will just dismiss a few charges. For example, like let's say that you have a case for driving without a license, and then you have a case for petty theft in a store, and then you have another case for driving without a license, let's say, since driving without a license isn't really like a violent crime, it's not something that's, I believe that the law has changed right now, and it's an infraction now. It used to be what they called a wobbler, is a type of crime that can be charged as, either misdemeanor or an infraction, or it can be charged as a felony or an infraction. It can be either way, So again, in this example, like if you have 3 cases, 2 of them are for driving without a license, maybe the offer that the district attorney will make to you will be, we will dismiss the 2 cases for driving without a license, but on this petty theft one, we will offer you, we will dismiss it as well if you go and take a class for, not stealing or something like that. That's usually what I see in court for petty theft. The COVID lockdown affected me a lot with the mask. I would say that the masks made it much more difficult to do my job because I have to talk constantly, interpret everything that everyone is saying. So if I have a mask, that just makes it much more difficult. As an interpreter in court, sometimes you have to speak low so that you don't interrupt everyone else that's in court, but you are loud enough for the defendant. And if you're speaking low and you're wearing a mask, that makes it harder because you kind of have to speak louder for the defendant to hear you, but then you don't want to speak too loud to interrupt everyone else, the judge, the clerk, the reporter, the attorneys. So it makes it harder that way. It also just makes it harder to breathe. And I was kind of blessed that when COVID hit in my court, interpreters were considered essential employees. A lot of my coworkers got to go home for some weeks while others of us had to keep going to work, which I was fine with that because I don't know how a lot of people were able to just, stay quarantined in their houses for a long time. But I would say that it also changed things for example, when it comes to trials, again, when they select a jury to avoid having to speak so much in court, they started making questionnaires for jurors to fill out rather than having to answer everything that they're being asked of in court. So the questionnaires just reduce a lot of the time for the jury to get selected because, everyone at the same time is filling out the questionnaire, writing down if they have any bias, if they have any prejudice against this type of crime, against the defendant, things like that, So then the judge and the attorneys review the questionnaires, and that just cuts down on so much time rather than having to ask every single possible juror every single question that's on the questionnaire out loud in open court. A lot of jails started releasing defendants because of that. I mean, no, they didn't release them because they had COVID, but a lot of crimes for which a lot of people could have gone to jail, instead of just going to jail, what they would do is just cite and release them. They would give them a citation for when to appear in court, and they would let them go, So I don't think it kept more people in jail because of that. And the people that were in jail that got COVID, I know that they quarantined them. I mean, I don't know how well the process was to quarantine someone that's in jail, because what do you do it once they infected everyone else? Like, it's not like jails have specific COVID areas. At least that's what I think.
In 2021, it was said that prison deaths linked to COVID were up 73%. And from 1999 to 2016, the number of people 55 or older in in-state and federal prisons increased to 280%, which people with high immunocompromise were at high risks such as diabetes and chronic health conditions. Small quarters, for example prison cells, were areas where the virus would stick around longer in the air. Prisons became super spreaders, not just for inmates, but for staff that work inside as guards and doctors, handymen. Once they left to the outside, they would contribute to spreading the virus. Prison population declined by 157,500 people during the first 6 months through the end of August in 2020. 24 states released a total of 37,700 prisoners from prison on an expedited basis, earlier than scheduled from March 2020 to February 2021. Parole boards also approved fewer releases in the first year of the pandemic than the year before. The response of government was so bad that in total 10% fewer people were released from prison and jails in 2020 than in 2019. As a result, at the end of the first year of the pandemic, 19 prison systems were at 90% capacity or higher. So according to prisonpolicy.org, if the governments failed to undertake the large-scale release necessary to confront the pandemic, how is it possible that the incarcerated population is lower now than it was in 2019? Reductions in the number of people in our nation's prisons were not a result of goodwill for incarcerated people, concern for their health and safety, or a concerted effort to end mass incarceration. Instead, they were primarily an unintended consequence of court delays and suspensions of transfers from local jails early in the pandemic. Many of the same factors that snarled our nation's supply chain and made it more difficult to get appointments for various services also slowed down the process of sending people to prison. These delays were temporary, though, as governments adapted to the virus, they quickly returned to business as usual, and prisons and jail populations began creeping back up again.
I remember a trial that I did before COVID, actually, where this inmate was being charged because he had assaulted an officer. But from what I remember, the defendant was saying that he belonged to a gang, and at that prison where he was at, they needed to keep the gangs separated. They couldn't be in the same courtyard. And they came up to him, the officers came up to him, and they told him they were going to take him out to the yard. And he told the officers, "You can't take me out to that yard because a lot of the inmates that are there are from this gang that we're not friends with." So apparently the officers didn't really care much, and they just tried dragging him out to the yard. And while he was being dragged out, he started just kicking and screaming, and he accidentally kicked one of the officers, and because of that he was charged with assaulting an officer. And I don't know exactly what happened. Obviously I was not there, but to me it just seemed that the correctional officers were just trying to get back at him and get him in more trouble, get him to be charged with the new case and stuff. And I've heard from coworkers that a lot of correctional officers aren't as nice as they seem to be, but I don't really know that out of my own experience. I don't know whether they're nice to defendants or not. I don't know whether they would do such a thing, but at the same time, I'm not surprised that they would. And I think that in this defendant's case, he obviously was found guilty, or if he was not found guilty, I don't remember exactly what happened, but he wasn't exonerated for that crime. Like, he obviously stayed in there. He was already in there because he had committed some crime in the past, so he was in prison. If you're in prison already serving a sentence and you commit a crime within the prison, then you could end up having a new case against you, and that could add to the sentence that you're already in there for. I can remember off the top of my head that I've heard of 2 cases where the inmates, while in prison already serving a sentence, they murder someone in there, like either like a cellmate because they don't like that person or because they belong to another gang that's not theirs. And I think that these people probably do things like that because they don't care anyway. They don't care that they get sentenced because they're already in jail for something that they did. They're probably serving a life sentence. So they're thinking, oh, what does it matter if I get in trouble for this, if I kill someone, because I'm going to be in jail anyway. But from an interpreter's point of view, we don't get to deal that much with inmates that are already in prison and commit a new crime, because I feel that many of those people, since they're already in jail, they have to learn how to communicate. And so they probably pick up English while they're in there. It may not be the best English, but they are still able to communicate with them. They don't really need an interpreter, or if they need an interpreter, they understand a lot of English. So there's not really much that an interpreter can do, I feel, to help them. There's another witness that I remember I did not very long ago where it was a civil case. The whole issue comes to like the languages, So in Spanish, you can, when you speak a sentence, you can omit the subject of the sentence, and the subject is just implied by the verb conjugation. Like if you can just say quiero, which means I want, but you're just saying want. You're not saying the I is implied. And in English, you can't. You have to mention the subject, right? So I remember that they were asking this witness something. Had the plaintiff, in this case, since it was a civil case, told her something along the lines of like, if he were to kill her, like no one would ever find out or something like that. So I can't remember exactly what they asked her, but I think that it was, so why did you do this? And so she answered in Spanish saying, porque dijo que quería matarme y quería dejar evidencia. So those are 2 sentences where she omitted the subject because, like I said, in Spanish, you can just omit it. So I interpreted that in English saying because he wanted to kill me and he wanted to leave evidence. So then the whole, they kept asking her questions and everything, but I kept thinking, I was like, that doesn't make sense. How come, he wanted to kill her and he wanted to leave evidence? So I just remember stopping at one point and asking her to clarify. And then what she meant was that he wanted to kill her and she wanted to leave evidence. So if you add the subjects in Spanish, it was porque él quería matarme y yo quería dejar evidencia, because he wanted to kill me and I wanted to leave evidence. But since she left out that I on the second one, I just understood it as, so I wanted to leave evidence. Quería matarme y quería dejar evidencia. That's one of those things where you can see the nuances of the languages, where if you're not an interpreter, it's hard to really extract the message and try to convey it. And even if you're an interpreter, like in my case, like I had to stop and clarify with her, because otherwise what she said, yes, it was grammatically correct and everything, but it just didn't make sense. Why would someone threaten you to kill you and want to leave evidence, I remember interpreting in a case where they were trying to get divorced. Usually, when it comes to divorce cases, the parties have to see what they can agree to, that they can settle, and whatever points or issues they can't settle, then they take it to trial. And I remember that there are points or issues that you can solve between the two of you. Let's say a man and a woman that are married, they have, let's say, 2 cars and they have a house, okay? So those things need to get divided between them, the 2 cars and the house. If they agree to, say like, I get to keep 1 car, you get to keep the other car, but when it comes to the house, we don't agree with what we're going to do, then they can take that issue to trial and the judge can take evidence. And then the judge can rule whether, the house will go to one party or to the other party, or if it has to get sold and the proceeds have to be divided between the 2 of them. So that's what I mean by taking some issue trial. So I remember in one case where there was a couple who was married and the man, through his father, owned a lot of property. I think that they were maybe 8 or 18. I don't remember very well, but I do remember that the case took about a week in trial because the man, even though he spoke English and he spoke it really well and was probably his main language, he wanted to have an interpreter. I feel sometimes a lot of people think that by having an interpreter, maybe the judge will have more leniency, they'll have more mercy towards them. And that's not really the case. And, but they still want an interpreter. And you can't deny that to them. If someone says, I need an interpreter, you have to be there and interpret for them, no matter what, even if they speak really well English or not. So I just remember that the two parties obviously had attorneys and they were fighting that whole property issue, like, which houses belong to the man, even though his father bought them but put him under the man's name. And they were trying to figure all of that out so that to see who gets what, or if what properties need to get sold and who gets the proceeds from that sale. I just remember the case being really long. A lot of the questions were not answered directly by the witnesses. They would, ramble on about other things rather than really sticking to what is being asked and answering that. And it was just really long and a lot of repetition going on in that trial. I remember the judge who was not friendly. I just remember in the end saying thank you to me. Thank you for interpreting. I know that was hard, like at the very end of the trial. A court reporter and a court interpreter, I feel, have a lot of similarities when it comes to performing their job. We need people to speak clearly, to speak slowly, to speak loudly enough for us to either interpret or to write down what they're saying. We don't like people who mumble. We don't like people who stutter. All of those things that can make our job much more difficult. I feel that that's what we share in common. We need to be able to hear clearly. I would say that's pretty much everything we have in common. They obviously just have to write down everything that's being said in court, the court reporter, and then they have to review it afterwards, like proofread it and prepare it to have a transcript ready for whoever requests a transcript of the proceedings. I would say that if you speak enough English that you can understand what's going on, you should not ask for an interpreter. If you feel very confident about how well you speak, how well you understand, you shouldn't ask for an interpreter because you either think that it's going to be too hard to hear it in English. No, because interpreters are not there to dumb down the language for you. They're there to just put you on an equal footing with the English speakers, So if whoever is speaking in court, whether it's a judge or it's an attorney, and they're using really high register words, then that's what the interpreter will be putting out in Spanish. And if you don't know them in English very well, I doubt that you're going to know them in Spanish very well either. I would say that if you speak English really well, if you're comfortable in English where you can understand the questions that they're asking you and you can express yourself in English, you shouldn't request an interpreter because an interpreter, we're all humans as interpreters and we can all make mistakes. So you kind of run the chance of having a mistake when you use an interpreter. If a lot of people think that interpreters are there to make people understand what's going on, but that's not our role. We're just there to provide you access to everything that is being said in English. So if in English they use high register words, and register meaning, there are different types of levels in a language. There's high register, low register, medium register. And the best example that I can give for understanding what they are is, the way you talk to your friends is a very low register. You, instead of saying like good morning or good afternoon, you might say what's up. That's a very low register. A medium one might be saying hello to your friend, and a high register would be, good morning, good afternoon. Those are different levels of communicating. So in court, if they're using high register, an interpreter is going to put out that same high register in the foreign language. The interpreter is not there to help you understand with the low register. The interpreter is there to give you access to what is being said in English, but in the foreign language that you speak. So by requesting an interpreter because you think that the judge will be more lenient to you or because you think that you will understand better in Spanish, you're just, you're running the risk of having a mistake being made. I have another story, a really quick one too. I just remember this was like a civil case. It was a small claims case, and it was a lady. She was the plaintiff. She had hired this man who was the defendant to do some work at her house. I think to like do a bathroom or something like that. And I just remember that when she started saying that he started saying things to her, or she did. I don't remember exactly, but I just remember there was an audience in the back and there was a mediator, because in a lot of small claims cases they have a mediator who will try to resolve the cases instead of them having to go to trial. And the mediator speaks Spanish, and this was many years ago. And I remember the woman just saying, "Es un animal con patas," and the only translation I could think of in the moment was, "This is a legged animal," which is the correct translation, but it doesn't convey like the anger or, the feeling that was said in Spanish originally, because, patas in Spanish is the word that you use specifically for animals. Those are the legs for animals. People have piernas. Piernas and patas are different things. They're the same thing meaning wise, like humans and animals have them. But in Spanish, one is for animals, one is for humans. And in English, you don't have those two words that make that distinction. So I just remember that afterwards, the mediator just told me, he looked at me after the case was over and he was like, "That was kind of hard. I saw that you struggled." And he was kind of laughing himself, And up to this day, I will run into him in the hallway or something, and he will just say that word to me and just start laughing. We'll both start laughing about it because, it's one of those stories, that you have while you're working, kind of like an inside joke type of thing, So I remember one time a juvenile case, a dependency case, which is, when either CPS, Child Protective Services, steps in and takes away your children, because you either are not giving them a good living environment at home, or someone calls and complains that you're beating your child, and then, they come out and they take your child away and things like that. And I remember that in one case, I was interpreting for the dad with his attorney. They were having a private conference, and the dad was telling the attorney how the girl that was his stepdaughter was just lying about him molesting her, I think, and that she just wanted attention in school, I think, something like that, because he had asked her, like, "Why did you do that?" And then she said, "Well, because my friend at school said that, like, she had gone through something like that, and I wanted to make her feel better, so I said that I was going through that too." But, they took her away from him. There's this case now, and, it's one of those situations where I think that as an interpreter, you are in shock and you kind of just stop interpreting at the same time, because you're trying to process, or in your mind you're thinking like, is this real? Like, is this really what's happening? And I get, for example, my cousin, whenever I tell her stories about my job, she tells me, "I don't know if I could be an interpreter, because if I hear something that's shocking or something that's funny, like, I'll just start laughing right there and then, or like, I'll just be in awe that I won't be able to interpret." And I tell her, as an interpreter, you have to keep going. Like, you can't show any emotion or anything like that. So there have been very few instances where I do just stop and think to myself, like, this is shocking. Like, I can't believe I'm hearing this. And I don't remember the rest of the details of the case, but I think also the police officer that went out to that case where this girl had been lying, like, told the man that, he was going to get him into jail, and he was going to make sure that he rots in there, and that the social worker that was involved in that case too, the man thinks that she and the police officer were in cahoots, like they were trying to work together and trying to get him to go to jail and everything like that. I don't remember very much the outcome or the details, but it's one of those cases where I feel like it's horrible, because you have this child that is lying about what's happening. She gets taken away from the parents. Now the parents have this court case against them. They have to now take classes to get reunified with the child in the future and things like that. It's those cases where they just leave you thinking, like, is there hope in a case like this? I try to detach myself from the emotions that you see in court, because at the end of the day, you don't want to take them home and keep feeling what those people are feeling in court. But when it comes to like children getting sentenced for crimes that they've committed themselves, a lot of times it's the parents' fault, I feel. The parents don't really put a stop to their behavior, which in turn just becomes worse and worse as they grow older, and they hang out with the wrong crowd, then they end up doing drugs, or they end up going to places where, they can end up committing a crime and stuff. So I feel like the parents, it may be really hard to see their child get sentenced. And I don't have any children, so I wouldn't know what that feels like, But again, I feel like if the parents had been more strict with the child, maybe this wouldn't have happened, I've seen in court people who, I don't want to say children because they're usually just adults, but you see their parents come to court, or their children that just became adults, like maybe they're 19, 20, and the parent comes to court and they start telling you, the interpreter, maybe because they think that you can somehow do something, and they start telling you like, oh, well, that's not true. Like, he was a good person. He didn't do that. Like, he just hangs out with, blah, 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 blah. And you take a look at the defendant, you look at him up and down, and you see all these tattoos. You can just tell that they're not a nice person. You can tell that they're not someone who goes to school to study, or someone who is a hard worker, who just the way they look, you can tell that whole idea of don't judge a book by its cover, I feel like it's not really true. You can judge a book by its cover. If you see a defendant who has like all these tattoos and like all these piercings and stuff, and again, I'm not saying that like everyone that has tattoos and has piercings is a criminal, but if you see a person like this and you can see the way they're sitting, they don't care, their feet are like up, like they just don't care, that type of person, you can just tell they're not a saint, and here you have a parent saying like, oh no, like he's a nice person, like he was in a bad situation that day or something like that. I, as an interpreter, don't believe it, so I feel like the moment that they get sentenced, if a parent starts crying, it is sad if your child is going to jail, but at the same time, if you never really did anything while this child was growing up to like put restraints on him, like don't hang out with the wrong people, come home at a certain hour, in the end, they're going to end up doing whatever they want and they're going to commit a crime. I don't think that people wearing the wrong attire will contribute to their demise in a big way, but I do think it has some influence, either consciously or unconsciously, by the attorneys who are dealing with you, or even the judge. If you look at someone who's dressed professionally, who's there to take care of their case and to resolve it and everything, I feel like there will be a little bit of leniency, as opposed to someone who just shows up with like basketball shorts, flip-flops, and, they're just there because they have to be there, not because they really want to do something about their case or their lives. I think that it does matter. How much does it matter? I'm not really sure, but I think it does matter. One of the most horrendous case that I would say was a trial that I recently did, in which this man was angry that something had happened to him. He was kicked out of a place and he wanted to take it out on someone. So he went home, grabbed a weapon, and he went back to that place, waited outside, and the people that came out, he approached one of them, and then he just took that person to his place and then just killed that person right there in his bedroom, and then got rid of the body in his own property. I would also say that when it comes to interpreting, now all of these years that I've been doing it, which have been going on 7, is that the more time goes by, the more I realize that languages are not literal. They're more, I feel like this is going to be kind of hard to explain, but I feel like languages are synonyms of like concepts in the real world. There's not one way to say one thing. You can say it in many different ways. In other words, you can do it in synonymous phrases or in synonyms, and languages are just that to me. For example, like if you look at a picture frame, the word frame can be un marco, un cuadro in Spanish, they're a synonym of each other. There's no like black or white, I feel, when it comes to languages. There are many ways to say one thing, to express yourself. One example that my coworker has always told me is, for example, if someone says to you, suerte in Spanish, like if they say suerte in English, that means good luck. The word good wasn't mentioned, it's implied. Only the word luck was said. But the only way to interpret that with that tone, suerte, it means good luck. It doesn't mean bad luck. You wouldn't wish someone bad luck that way. So the more I realize that there are many instances where language is like that. Like you sometimes have to add a little more to convey the meaning that's being said, or you have to say it in a different way that will make sense. It's like I said earlier, languages are not math. You know, one word will not equal one word sometimes. One word will sometimes equal 3 words, 4 words, 7 words, you know?
So you stick to the truth, right? Well, depending who's asking you the questions can control the narrative and change the view on how the truth comes out. That can also have significant outcomes that affect your case. According to some legal counsel, they advise not to overshare information that the question didn't ask for. Although you might think you're helping, you might end up hurting your case. It's good to ask for clarification when you don't understand the question. Remember that if you don't understand the question, don't answer it, because you could give wrong answers that could hurt you or your case. Don't guess when answering either. Take your time to think clearly on what your response is. Mistakes do happen. If you can't remember, just say so, if that's the truth. There's also room to correct some errors you might have made.
You know, if the question is, for example, like, did you go to this property to collect rent? And then they will answer something like, well, you know, that day before going to collect the rent, I went to the bank, but then at the bank they told me that I needed to get this or that, you know, rather than just saying yes or no. Yes, I went to collect rent. They'll just start explaining something. Or sometimes they will answer something that has nothing to do with what the question is. You know, like if I ask you, like, what did you eat today? And you tell me, like, I'm wearing a red shirt, you know, that's not really answering what I'm asking you. That's what a lot of people do, you know, I feel. And especially in our cultures in Latin America, I feel that when it comes to guilt, you try to explain. If you try to explain to get out of guilt, that's what's culturally expected of us, you know? If you're short in our cultures, like if they ask you questions and you're just short, then people can interpret that as, you know, like, oh, he's hiding something, you know, he's not really telling the truth. But in English, here in the US, I feel like if you try to explain, the more you explain, the more it looks like you're guilty of something rather than just being direct to the questions that you're being asked. I feel that's a big cultural difference when it comes to, you know, people who live here but are from other countries and they have to go through the court system. I kind of stop them sometimes if I feel like I'm doing the consecutive mode, which is, you know, where the speaker will say a couple of phrases and then you interpret that and then you let them go on again and then you interpret that. I will stop them if I've noticed that they've answered enough, you know, but in the end, the people who should stop them are the attorneys, you know. But yes, there are some questions that are worded where I can just tell this answer is going to be just something that they're going to talk about. Like if they ask them, for example, like, what did the defendant say to you? What names did he call you? Like the moment they ask, like, what did he say or what did they call you? In my head, I can just think, oh my God, here we go. Like what bad word is going to be used? How difficult is it going to be interpreted into English? Especially if, you know, the Spanish from the witness is not the same Spanish that I speak, you know, like if we're from different countries. I think that's difficult. I remember a story. It was also a family law case. I think it was maybe a divorce. And I remember being with, it was a 2-interpreter case because both parties needed an interpreter, but both parties also had attorneys. So one of the parties had to testify. So he went to the witness stand and my colleague, the other interpreter, went to the witness stand with him and they started questioning him. So I was just interpreting to the other party that was just there listening to the questions and answers. And I remember that part of the issue was that there were some tools missing. So the question that they asked the man at the witness stand was, what were the tools? Can you tell me what the tools were? Or something like, we're going to go through each tool one by one. And I just remember looking at my coworker and we both made eye contact, having this kind of smile where she could tell like, oh God, like we know what's coming. Like tools are very technical terms and tools can vary depending on the country as well, like how you say, or even from regions, you know, like someone from a region of Mexico might call a tool something differently from a person from another region, you know? So I just remember looking at her and in my head thinking like, I am glad I'm not there right now, you know? But in the end, I think the judge was like, we're not really going to do this right now. Like, I think the judge was more like, come on, let's hurry up. Let's not get into like the whole list of like what the tools were. I think it was a divorce, and I think that the man was still waiting for some of his belongings to be given to him. I don't know if maybe he had already moved out of the house and he wanted to go get his stuff, and the tools were probably one of the things that he needed that the spouse was not giving to him, you know? So I think that maybe that was what he was fighting, what he wanted, the tools, you know?
I asked the linguist if his job has changed him in his personal life or the way he sees things in the world.
I would say that it's made me be more aware of my surroundings. Wherever I go, it kind of makes me question people's motives. Anyone that I see out on the street, I think that now I have more of an idea of, like, you know, why is this person approaching me? Like, what do they want? Is there something going on that they want? Are they trying to, you know, jump me or do something, but they're pretending to be nice and things like that? I mean, not that it happens often that people approach me on the street, but I'm just saying that now I'm more aware. I question that more than before. Someone would approach me, I would have been like, oh, you know, maybe they need something, they want something, but not anymore. And I don't feel sad. I just feel disappointed, I think, in general with human beings, because what you see in court, you see the evil side of human beings by the types of crimes that get committed, you know, murdering people or just assaulting them or doing harm to them, you know. All of that, it just makes me feel disappointed in general about the evil side of human beings. And it's kind of hard to see the good side now. Not that there isn't any good side to human beings, but the evil is what stands out more, I feel, than the good in a lot of cases. In a lot of cases that go to court, obviously, because, you know, if people do evil stuff and they commit crimes, then they're going to court. People who do good stuff don't go to court, you know? So all I'm seeing every day is the bad stuff, and that does have an influence on my outlook on life in the end.